Hi, everyone. After reading some of your discussion posts this week about George Saunders' story Puppy, I thought I should clarify some things about narrative point of view. The editors of our textbook write a perfectly competent explanation of it, but I think uh, the way they go about it and organize their thoughts might be making it harder for you to really grasp what point of view is all about and why it's important to think about it when reading fiction. Furthermore, I think that their use of the word voice confuses things because they use that word to in a very broad way as a mixture of things like tone and style, which are themselves hard to define. Most of us, I think, have been taught to think of voice in terms of grammatical constructs like first person voice, second person voice, third person voice, and so on. So let's just clear the decks and say that voice in the context of this class just refers to those grammatical constructs we know as first person, third person, and so on. The editors also introduce you to the term focus, and I do think that focus is an important part of understanding narrative point of view. So, what exactly is focus? Well, generally speaking, focus is the scope of reporting used by the narrator of a story. That is, focus refers to how much of the physical or fictional world gets reported to the reader. The scope can be broad or it can be very narrow. We can say that it functions something like a camera lens that zooms out or zooms in to expand or contract the range of things to be photographed. So, voice and focus work together to form the narrative point of view of a story. Now, there are certain points of view that we see again and again in works of fiction, and I'd like to introduce you to the most common ones now. So basically, the two most common are the first person voice and the third person voice. And I'll talk about the third person voice first because that's the one that historically has been used more often in literary fiction than any other. The third person voice uses the pronouns he, she, and they. And points of view that use the third person voice can generally have either an omniscient focus, what we call an omniscient focus, or a limited focus. The omniscient focus is an all knowing focus, like God. This kind of narrative voice can report on all the characters' thoughts, all their actions, as well as all the places and times in which the events of a story take place. And that includes even events that take place in two different places at the same time. It's a sort of free floating consciousness with the power to do things that actual human beings cannot do. Now, the omniscient focus can itself be broken down into two subtypes, the intrusive and the unintrusive. Simply put, the intrusive type means that the narrator makes comments on, or even makes judgments about, events, actions, characters, and so on in the story. The unintrusive simply does not. Okay, so that's it for the third person omniscient point of view. Now let's turn to the second type of third person focus, what we call the limited third person voice. The limited third person focuses usually on just one character's actions, and on rare occasions it could be a few characters, but usually just one. When using a limited focus, an author can choose the degree to which the narrative voice is limited. In some cases, the third person limited point of view might be extremely limited, so that readers only learn about the external actions and dialogue of a single character, but they know nothing about the thoughts or the feelings of that character. So this very limited focus we call the objective third person point of view. Ernest Hemingway, by the way, was a master of this particular view. And if you want an example, you could read the very, very short story called Hills Like White Elephants. But an author can limit things even more, such that all the reader gets, the only thing they get, are the thoughts of one single character. So this particular focus is unusual. It's called the interior monologue. Interesting stories that use the interior monologue point of view will use the pronoun I, which causes some readers to think that the story is written in the first person voice, which technically speaking isn't true with interior monologues. Okay, so now let's turn to the next most common narrative voice, the first person voice. This kind of narrative voice uses the pronoun I, and there are three common focuses that you should know about. They are the witness, the marginal participant, and the main character. So the witness type of first-person voice is someone who does not take part in the events of the story. The witness focuses and reports on the actions of the story's other characters. The marginal participant, by comparison, refers to the narrative voice of a character who does in some way participate in the action of the story. How much they participate can vary quite a bit. And finally, of course, there are many famous works of literature in which the narrative first-person voice is that of the main character of the story. Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener is a wonderful example of this. The focus in this case is primarily on the narrator themselves. Now, it should be added that any of these first-person narrative focuses, whether that of the witness, the marginal participant, or the main character, any of them can be naive, and so we call them naive narrators. Often they are children. That is, the narrator, regardless of their focus, is a person who doesn't understand what's going on around them, not perfectly, or they don't understand the implications of certain events in the story. So Huck in Huckleberry Finn, for example, is a famous naive narrator, and I think most people would consider Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird to also be a naive narrator. In addition, with almost any narrative point of view, there are certain narrators that just can't be trusted to tell us truthfully or accurately what's going on around them, and we call these kinds of narrators unreliable narrators. So why is any of this important to our study of literature? How does understanding point of view help us analyze it and appreciate it? Well, here's why. An author's choice of point of view controls the entire nature of the story, and I mean it completely controls it. And in turn, how that story is controlled determines how we readers will experience the story and respond to it. So let's think for a moment about George Saunders' story, Puppy. What is the voice in that story? To answer that, we just look at the pronouns being used. And we will see that they are like he, she, and they kinds of pronouns, indicating that this story uses the third-person narrative voice. Then we want to know, what is the focus? Is it broad or really limited? Well, as you know, the narrator freely moves from character to character and can report on events and actions and thoughts and dialogue both in the present moment of the story and in the past. So we can say that the focus is an omniscient one. So what we're talking about here is a third-person omniscient point of view. Now, what's important to understand here is that Saunders chooses this point of view because it allows him to reveal a central idea or theme in the story. The idea that what might appear to be cruelty is actually a form of compassion. The narrator doesn't tell us this. That would ruin the story. But we as readers nevertheless pick up on it because this omniscient narrator is able to tell us everything about the characters. The narrator tells us, what has happened to Marie in the past and what has happened to Callie. And when we know that, Then we understand their motivations, even though each of these women would not know why the other behaves the way they do. And if you think about it, if Puppy were told from a completely different point of view, the theme of cruelty and compassion would not even arise. Like, what if, for example, the story were told from the first person point of view, from Marie's husband's point of view, especially if he were the main character? This easygoing guy, if the story is all about him, how could this theme even begin to arise, this theme of cruelty versus compassion? So you see, our experience of the story would have changed completely. The meaning of the story would be completely different for us. Our response to it would be completely different if it were written from that point of view. So keep in mind, authors choose their point of view because they want to ultimately produce particular responses in us, their readers. They want to produce particular intellectual understandings, emotional depth, even spiritual or moral insights. So try this exercise with other stories that you read. Ask yourself, what is the voice the narrator is speaking in? Is it first person, second person, or whatever? And then you can do that by just examining the pronouns being used. Then ask yourself, what is the focus? Is it broad or is it narrow? Is it omniscient? Is it limited? Is it the voice of a witness or the main character of the story? And so on. And when you have the answers to both of those questions, then you know what the full point of view is. Once you've established what the point of view is, then you can ask the all-important question, how does this narrative point of view function? How does it produce the experience of the story that we have? Why did the author choose it? What does it reveal? What does it possibly obscure? So your answers to these questions will really help you appreciate the power of literature. Okay, that's it for this little talk. Please let me know if you have any questions.